Dodge Billingsley is a fellow at the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies. He's also the director of combat films and research based in Salt Lake City, Utah, and a senior faculty member at the Naval Postgraduate School's Center for Civil Military Relations. He's been a longtime observer, as many of you know, of various wars and contested regions, and has spent considerable time with U.S. and foreign militaries worldwide, including Chechen insurgent forces, Turkish special forces, and Republic of Korea Marines. He is embedded with U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan and has produced a wide array of media from his field work, including 2 books, Operation Anaconda, America's First Conventional Battle in Afghanistan, and the second one, Fangs of the Lone Wolf, Chechen Tactics in the Russian-Chechen Wars, 1994-2009. His documentary films have won the prestigious Rory Beck and Royal Television Society Awards, and he's produced and directed the Kennedy Center series Beyond the Border, now getting to our 10th film. He's an avid collector of realism art and serves on the advisory board of Utah Valley University's Woodbury Art Museum and co-curated numerous exhibits of Chinese revolutionary and Soviet social realism art at various universities in the Western United States. He has lectured extensively at various universities and institutions, including the Kennedy Center, and is a regular contributor to Jane's Defense Weekly and Jane's Intelligence Reviews. Dodge Billingsley received a BA in History from Columbia University and an MA in War Studies from King's College in London. The topic of today's presentation, ISIS and the New Middle East. Please join me in welcoming Dodge Billingsley.
Okay, it's great to see everybody here. Some of you know I come to the Kennedy Center usually every semester to give a lecture, and I'm excited about this one. Although I don't know if everybody's here to see me or just they were hoping to win the new iPad. I mean, I'm not sure how many of the bloggers are here, but either way, it's good to have a nice crowd. You know, when I was putting this lecture together, do I need to start it with, oh, there it is, okay. You know, last semester I was here and I talked about ISIS briefly, and I looked at it very much from a sort of a leadership position because I had some sort of skin in the game because I have a lot of interaction with the Chechen community, and the senior military leader of ISIS is a Chechen, this guy right over here. Oh, wait, oh, okay. Anyway, so this is the wrong lecture. This is the wrong PowerPoint slide, so I apologize for that. All right, there we go. Jeez, sorry for the rough start. Man, this is not going well. So again, what's going on in ISIS this week? What are we thinking about? Okay, we know we have U.S. airstrikes, and the report came out that they've weakened ISIS in Iraq, but they haven't weakened them in Syria. In fact, they've gained more territory in Syria, and this map has come up just recently, and the red represents the sort of growth of ISIS-controlled territory in Syria. Now, granted, a lot of that is desert, but they control those areas there. We have an issue of U.S. policy and U.S. mission creep. I mean, the idea that we started airstrikes in the later part of 2014 to work with the Iraqi army and services there has sort of held them at bay, held them in check in Iraq, but we are faced with sort of policy creep. Today, we saw the Canadian Armed Forces exchange fire with ISIS elements. Now, they were training Iraqi forces, but when they come head-to-head, they're going to have to fight. So this idea that Westerns aren't going to fight, we're not going to have any boots on the ground that are combat. Every soldier that goes on the ground in Iraq is combat ready and combat proficient. And if it happens and it's necessary, we're going to end up fighting these guys. I was just out at PACOM last week talking to the 25th Infantry Division, and they're thinking about this now because they're part of the Pacific shift toward the shift toward the Pacific. However, they're next on the patch chart, so when first ID rotates out, it could be the 25th that has to go in and bring up the divisional headquarters there, under which it all will sort of fall under all the U.S. effort. We know that U.S. forces are all out at Al-Assad Air Base there, which is the big base. It's got two 18,500-foot runways there, and that's where we had the largest the Marines were there forever. In fact, I was there in 2011 when we withdrew from that base. We were the last unit to withdraw from that base. We closed it up, the last MRAPs to drive out of there. And now we have trainers there training 7 Iraqi infantry regiments, apparently. And I just saw the contract come through for jet fuel, so it looks like we're going to start running some sort of air operations out of there, whether it's fixed wing or rotary, I don't know. But we have what we call, sometimes we hear mission creep, and it's starting to happen. And then it puts us in a very uncomfortable position, sort of, I mean, depending on who you talk to, but we're sharing the skies with Iranian Air Force planes that are also attacking ISIS targets. And so this is sort of unprecedented, and it actually just sort of just talks a little bit to the complexity of what's going on in this area and with ISIS. So ISIS again, and if you were at my last lecture, I apologize if some of this is redundant, but you know, it started out as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, basically. And these beginnings are there before we even entered the region in 2003 in this war, you know, Operation Iraqi Freedom. And, but they're known as AQI, or Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. And in 2006, they changed their name to ISI, or Al-Qaeda. And they actually start, and this is what's significant about ISI, one of the many things that's significant, is they're not just an ideology like Al-Qaeda. They're not necessarily just an insurgency. They actually brought up they've documented and put forward their legal justification, and they've written up their sort of manifestos like, this is why we are what we are, and this is what we're going to do what we're doing, and this is the rationale behind it. It's very much almost like standing up a state. They start to put all the functions, all the structures together, and that's what makes them sort of a different threat in the region. Again, they did this announcement to the people of the Birth of the Islamic State publication, sort of announced their intentions in 2006. And at the time in 2006, and this goes back to 2007, you had lots and lots of insurgent groups. And anybody who was in Iraq at the time, if you're a soldier, armed service member, or a contractor, or you know, USAID or UNHCR, et cetera, there were lots of groups that were fighting the U.S. there, but a lot of them were Iraqi nationalists. They weren't necessarily the sort of global caliphate, you know, kind of approach to rule in the Middle East. Well, and Al-Qaeda, or AQI, sort of distinguished themselves and separated themselves from a lot of these different groups. And in fact, they actually went to war verbally on their media campaigns with a lot of these groups, and in many cases actually went to battle against some of these groups because they had conflicting interests. You have to remember, and the insurgency in Iraq, when it started, in my opinion, from a couple key things. One is after we removed the Saddam regime, the U.S. forces, we had to make a decision of what to do with the Ba'athist army, 500,000 strong. And it's one of the most controversial decisions we ever had to make. Now, the Ba'athist regime was obviously tainted. It was Saddam's apparatus. It was hard to see how we could leave it in place, but when you basically put 500,000 former military personnel on the streets with nothing to do, who knew where the weapons were. If you look at the early parts of the insurgency, a lot of that was fueled by former Ba'athist elements. You also had Al-Qaeda type elements, and then you also had, and I've used this term before, but it was given to me by a defense intelligence DIA guy. He called them POIs. They called them pissed off Iraqis. And basically, these were Iraqis that lost somebody in the advance up. We killed one of their family members. Maybe we killed the whole family. 99 out of 100, it was an accident. But when you blow up a building on the corner, shrapnel can fly for blocks and people die. That's war. And what happened was you get a blood vendetta and people are just pissed off because the Iraqis, so they called them POIs. And so when the early estimates that I saw in 2004 were that the insurgency was basically Ba'athist regime elements and POIs, and had this little sliver of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That what happens is it starts to gain more and more traction, where it becomes, until we got today, probably the strongest force. They are very good with their media. Again, they have the message to go with the direct action. They're not afraid to use violence. And of course, I mean, you saw the report yesterday. They killed 13 in the city of Mosul, 13 teenage boys for watching a soccer game. Executed them in the square, and the parents were afraid to go pick up the bodies because they didn't want to know who belonged to who. So they're not afraid to use violence. And if you go on the web, you can find stuff you'd never, ever really want to see. But it's all out there because they push that stuff out. They like that this stuff is being pushed out. They have what's basically a Ministry of Operation, martyrdom operations. And again, they have a very strong sort of sense of, okay, where's the pointer? The top one? There it is. A very strong sense of statehood. In fact, if you look at just the evolution itself, in fact, we'll get to that in a second here. In 2013, they changed their name from Islamic State to Iraq, and ISL, which is sometimes referred to now IS, the Islamic State. And here's the thing. They don't just want Syria and Iraq. The Islamic State it's a regional caliphate. I mean, they want it all. And so we don't talk about the Jordans and Lebanon and these other places like this, but if for some reason these two countries, Iraq and Syria, were to fall to this outfit, they're going to go after Jordan and these others, because why wouldn't you? And in fact, those are the weaker ones. This is not going to be that more, that would be the easier ones probably as far as territory gains. So, but again, going back, they were really sort of fighting with some of the other groups, but they always put out enough information to always sort of propel them forward as well. And if you look at some of the findings from the special report, which I thought was pretty interesting, Radio Free Europe did this report, and they found that there was just enough out there in the region, enough issues to actually support ISIS. And ISIS has not gone away. It's actually gotten stronger. They've been rolled back a bit, but they don't seem to have any lack of recruits. They don't seem to have any inability to fight. And again, they pay their fighters. It's actually run like a state army. They pay their fighters an average of $400 a month. And most insurgent groups can't claim that. They have their structure. They're the beneficiary of lots and lots of U.S. equipment that was left over when we left it. In fact, I left the Al-Assad Air Base. We left more than 600 SUVs on that base alone. And it was actually kind of crazy because we each had an SUV the last month because there was only 200 of us, right? And so the base was huge, Al-Assad Air Base. And I remember when I got into the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, the force provider there was a armored infantry guy out of Fort Bliss, and they had an attachment of the 82nd there as well. And they just said, any car you see, just look, and if the keys are in it, it's yours. So we found a nice, cool, bulletproof Suburban, and that was what we drove all around. It was a huge base, so you needed a car to get anywhere. But that was just one thing. We left 2,300, two-man apartment kind of Connex. I mean, we left everything there, and a lot of the stuff has fallen into the hands of IS. And so, in addition to all the army weapons they were able to seize from retreating Iraqi armed elements, they're relatively well armed. Going back to some of the leadership, I mean, Zarqawi, and again, I thought it was interesting watching American Sniper, how they were targeting this guy. And this guy was, he was a bad guy, and he was the real deal. In my opinion, when you look back on insurgent fighters, I look at bin Laden, I think, okay, here's an ideologue. And Zawahiri, here's an ideologue. They don't pick up the gun. They don't go out and fight. But when you look at guys like Zarqawi, and there was a guy in Chechnya many years ago named Al-Khattab, was the same way. These guys were the real deal. They not only preached it and taught it, but they fought it. And this guy was very brutal. He was known for the candy bombings that targeted Iraqi children, so much so that Zawahiri and from Al-Qaeda actually sent him a letter, and we intercepted it and translated it, and and they basically said, you got to stop killing fellow Muslims because you're actually distancing the gap. This is not good for Al-Qaeda because you're just killing everybody, and the sort of idea that it's a means to an end. But anyway, the U.S. got him in 2006. He was replaced by another leader, Rashid al-Baghdadi, who went under a lot of different aliases. He was killed in 2010, and he's replaced by Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who apparently we had in Camp Bucca, which was a big prison, one of the prisons there for a while. But to say that we let him go and he led to ISIS is ridiculous. It's political fodder because, frankly, there were tens of thousands of people went through the Iraqi detention system, people that the U.S. and the coalition rounded up. You can't keep them all. We don't know. We didn't have the intel to tell us everybody who was bad or everybody who would turn out to be bad or to go anti to what the state was. Anyway, what happens in Al-Qaeda, there's an interesting split, is as the war in Syria takes off, Al-Qaeda in Iraq shifts over to Syria. Then they get teamed up with another group called Al-Nusra Front, and it's another sort of Al-Qaeda affiliate, and they split. And he demands that Al-Nusra Front split and go with them, and they come under their command. And Zawahiri, Al-Qaeda, who's now kind of in charge since bin Laden's been gone, basically says, no, they don't have to do that. They don't answer to you. They answer, it's kind of to us. And again, this is all, when I say answer, it's not a state system. I mean, Al-Qaeda is a global phenomenon, but it's an ideology that works in a cell-structured kind of way. But anyway, with that split, that caused a split, and that's why ISIS is considered as not Al-Qaeda in Iraq anymore. It doesn't mean that Al-Qaeda in Iraq doesn't exist. There are Al-Qaeda elements there because the ideology is there. If you go to the French attacks just, 2 weeks ago now, Was it 2 weeks ago? I mean, one claimed ISIS, one claimed, or IS, one claimed Al-Qaeda affiliation. Who knows if they were affiliated? I mean, is there any sort of paper trail, or is there any sort of money exchange? Is there any sort of anything tangible to tell us that that really was the case? Or were they just inspired by IS and Al-Qaeda? You know, I mean, in many cases, you don't need a paper trail to say I'm a member of Al-Qaeda or IS, or, you know, because it's an idea. It's an idea. And if you feel the same way, you can latch onto it and take that idea with you and use it. But anyway, there's a big split, and so ISIS sort of becomes independent of that. Again, and ISIS is really good at recruiting. The French have documented over 1,000 of their Muslim citizens who have gone to join ISIS, many of them trying to return home, and they're at a real crossroads as to what to do with them. Because in a way, they go and fight for an organization that stands against everything the French Constitution stands for and the political system and duality, and they come back and they're not sure. And then, of course, the attacks in Paris in the last 2 weeks have really sort of amplified this sort of like this tough question about what to do with these kind of people that go. They've also been able to draw a lot of interest from other parts. This is Umar the Chechen, Abu Umar al-Shashani. I've been connected to the Chechen war since the early 90s, actually, and still keep in touch with lots and lots of Chechen combatants. And what's really interesting is you see Chechens now fighting in Ukraine and in Syria and Iraq. Now, the non-fundamentalists, the real nationalists, have gone to Ukraine, and their soul, if you listen to them, their motivation is just, I want to kill a Russian for what they did to Chechnya. That's it. Ukraine offers them that opportunity. So Isa Manayev and his battalion from Stockholm, because that's where they were refugees, they're now in eastern Ukraine fighting the Russians. I don't know what they're doing, or I don't even know how. A battalion in Chechnya, in Chechen terms, could mean like 10 guys, or it could mean, 600. I don't know. It's probably somewhere around 40. Because that's what it was in Chechnya. But the other hand, you got guys like this who have done quite well, been quite violent, exhibited decent leadership skills. I mean, this guy has everything. He was a Georgian Army veteran of the 2008 war with Russia, and then sometime after that, he sort of becomes a jihadist. His mother is a Chechen. His father is a Georgian, a Christian Georgian. His mother's a Chechen. They're known as Kists. They live in the Pankisi Valley in the Republic of Georgia. They're actually not. It's funny, depending on who you talk to. Chechens used to say the Kists, they're not us, they're like a distant cousin, but they're basically Chechens who sort of stayed south of the Caucasus mountain line, the mountains, like a century or so ago. But a number of these guys have shown up. Al-Nusra Front has a handful of these senior Chechen leaders as well. And so there's all kinds of people flying, heading in and out of ISIS right now. So the key point here is if we kill the U.S. or whoever it does kills Baghdadi, the current leader of IS, there's zero reason to think that IS will disappear. It's just it's like whack-a-mole. It's like the drone strikes in Pakistan. There was a time, and I believe this, and listening to reports and talking to soldiers that say, hey, we've taken out the middle level of Taliban leadership throughout this area for a while, but more just keep coming, more just keep raising up. I was walking back from the detention center at Bagram a few years ago, and when the detention center was still there. And I ran into a friend of mine at SOCOM, Special Operations Command, and he was really quite depressed. I'm like, what's going on? He goes, oh, Pakistan, He said, they're like the worst ally we have, He said the madrasas along that border there and the number of people that they churn out willing to participate in these kind of activities. He goes, we can't possibly stem this tide unless Pakistan does it. We just can't possibly do it. But he was sort of, his moment of depression that day. But he was okay after a steak. The good thing about Bagram, it's not a forward observation place, so there's always pretty decent food there. Anyway, but again, look at these things. This is what's interesting. When I say the new Middle East, I think about global repercussions a little bit. We talked about France a little bit. We have Boko Haram in Nigeria. Are they connected to IS? I don't think so. We have in Australia, didn't that guy claim to be an IS or IS inspired? But he also had a criminal record and some mental health issues. But again, what does it really mean to be have an IS sort of link? We know that there's recruitment efforts going on in Afghanistan. And then we see extreme violence in the Pakistani girl, the school attack, the officer's school about a month or so ago. And then Jordan, something that's off the radar. But again, I'm really worried about Jordan, actually. They have almost 1 million refugees, about 700,000 registered on the books for UNHCR, more than that flowing in. There's been hundreds and hundreds of unauthorized mosques be built in these slums all around Amman and different places built by a lot of these people. The law in Jordan is you can't once a mosque is put up, you can't destroy it. So the government can't destroy the mosques once they're up, even if they're unauthorized. So they're trying to get into these communities and make sure these mosques don't go up. A lot of these mosques are not monitored. They preach a lot of Islamic fundamentalism, a lot of jihad type doctrine. And again, it's kind of off the radar now, but these countries like this, I think, are going to be in real trouble in the future if we can't take care of it. What I threw this slide up for was, and is that Boko Haram, some of these other groups, it seems like, and this has been debated in the media, is there like a competition to see who can be as violent? You know, in other words, the Pakistani Taliban, they killed all these kids, these school kids, you know. Are they trying to now outdo ISIS? I don't know about that. I've never seen it. I've never heard of anything captured that connects any sort of dots like this. But I would say that there's just been a general rise in violence around. And the other interesting thing is they could probably inspire each other. Hey, this is working here, we'll do this. This is working here, we'll do this. Again, I don't know. We don't have any sort of direct connection. We don't have, as far as I know, any sort of email links between Boko Haram, for instance, and the command of ISIS or IS. But we do see a general sort of uptick in violence in lots of parts of the world. It seems like people are, and these forces are really willing to use extreme violence a little more forcefully. I mean, we have the issue now with the Japanese hostages. You know, they paraded out and did the video on, you know, I don't know. I don't know if that's going to end well or not, that IS has done. So how do we get here? Man, I've heard so many explanations, and I talked to soldiers a bunch, and I talked to a lot of different people, and we sort of talk about this. And one thing, I don't get this from the soldiers as much, but, you know, sometimes people say, well, the U.S. wars. And there's something to this. I mean, our history in the Middle East is a lot more detailed than this. But if you look at this, we kind of have a history. The interesting thing is in Desert Storm, we attack the Iraqi forces in Kuwait. We drive them out of Kuwait. We drive them back into Iraq. There's the highway of death. All that stuff, not all of it, but a lot of it's still sitting there. When you go out toward the Kabari crossing, you still pass this period where just on both sides of the roads, it's like a few miles of just Iraqi stuff, you know, all that stuff that we blew up, you know, and destroyed as they were trying to leave Kuwait. And it's sitting there, and it's kind of this interesting reminder. It's half covered in sand. You know, it's in the desert. But the point was there, we didn't move to remove Saddam Hussein at the time because, and I don't know why exactly, but I guess under the idea that who's going to replace him? What's going to replace him? In a Saddam Hussein, no one will argue he was a humanitarian or he's a good leader or anything like that, but at least you knew where he stood and what he was going to do. Then we launched Iraqi Freedom. We forced regime change, of course. And then we were there until about December 2011. We close out with Operation New Dawn, and we withdraw all our troops. And again, this has been a political football. I mean, when we withdrew troops, the right was like all over Obama for moving us out. But you know, remember that agreement was signed by President Bush. He followed through with the commitments of the Status of Forces Agreement. But the interesting thing, and I think the thing to really consider is, what good would it have done had we stayed? Would ISIS have been able to retake Iraq? No. But the second we leave, what happens? I mean, what we found ourselves, in my opinion, was sort of the third member or the sort of referee stuck between a civil war, or even you could say multiple civil wars, because you had sectarian violence, you had religious violence, you could say that's the same thing. You had ethnic violence, you had issues between the Kurds in the north, the Shias in the center, and the Sunnis in the center, and the Shias in the south. I'm not sure where we would have gone. You know, the longer we're there, put our boots on the ground and sort of put up that fence, then maybe we keep the peace for a while. But it's interesting. I don't know where we gain. In fact, when we pulled the MRAPs, the mine-resistant vehicles, through Kabari Crossing and into base in Kuwait, I remember that was like December, I think it was like the 16th for the unit I was with. And I was with the 82nd Airborne there, the lead element. And on the berm was a colonel there, and he was letting his, watching for his guys to come back. And I walked up to him, we started talking about it, and he just, he said, I'm glad for this war to end. He goes, one, I want to go back to our core competency. All we do is drive MRAPs around and wait to get hit by an IED or an EFP, an explosive force projectile. He says, it's time for us to relearn our core skills again. And he goes, plus, I don't know, what do? We just do the same thing over and over. And what is the end result? And when you leave, does it just, or in other words, you just forestall the inevitable? Good questions. I don't know the answer. Information. This is an interesting thing. I mean, we know that IS is a very sophisticated information campaign. But I thought this was kind of a funny well, it's funny, it's kind of tragic, but it's run by the Pew Foundation, I think, and they do these big surveys, and it's funny who benefited most from the war in Iraq. And overwhelmingly, all the states in the Middle East think the U.S. did. But I don't think that if you view it as, I don't think we feel like we benefited too much. I don't think we overwhelmingly think, wow, this is great, we got all this free oil. No, we didn't. We lost a lot of lives. We lost a lot of treasure. We spent a lot of time, and we're now back in Iraq. And so I think about this. This was last year's survey. And I sort of think about this in the context of the media battle, because and Al-Qaeda, larger Al-Qaeda, not Al-Qaeda in Iraq, they knew. This information is everything, and I've used this anecdotal story as well. When I was in Chechnya, I was friends with an IED team leader, and this guy would plant improvised explosive devices to knock out Russian armor, and he had a 5-man team. And so they had one guy carried the fuses, and one guy carried the 155 millimeter round or the anti-tank mines, whatever they were going to use as the IED. A couple guys for security, and one guy had a camera and his battery. He didn't even carry a gun. But his job was to film this attack on Russian equipment. And we know that this is the way it's been in Iraq as well. But the point was, they said, listen, you can blow up a Russian BTR or a U.S. Abrams tank, but if no one sees it or hears about it, it didn't happen on the global scale. Yes, the unit suffered casualties. That's terrible. We lost the tank. That's material gone. But for the global war, the global effort, if you can't publicize it and let people know that it happened, it doesn't matter. And in fact, in Russia, it was really amplified because Russia fights wars a little bit differently than the U.S., and especially in the older days. Russia can afford to lose people every week. The accountability isn't quite as what it is here. And so they, and the Chechens said, hey man, Russia, we get to kill a BTR full of Russian soldiers every week for eternity, and it wouldn't stop, the Russian, wouldn't stop Russia. What we have to do is convince outsiders and Russians that we're here, we're forced, and so media is all part of that thing. What I think is really interesting is the Middle East is full of information that have actually changed regimes. And if you go back and you look at Abdel Nasser, who is the president of Egypt, he comes to power in what was known as the Free Officers' Revolution, but he actually comes to power in what was known as the Transistor Revolution, because at the time, the Arab Middle East was basically illiterate. And what he did was he sort of skipped this idea, I'm going to write and put it in the newspaper, and he went to the radio, and you think, okay, of course you'd go to the radio, but not that obvious in late 1940s, early 1950s in Iraq, in Egypt. But he puts out this fiery sort of pan-Arab message it was pro-Egyptian. It was obviously an Egyptian message. And he's wildly popular in the beginning. He comes to power with, people love this guy to be in the beginning. If you look at the Iranian Revolution, it didn't just happen overnight. Yeah, the Shah was bad, the title was good, depending on which side of the fence you're on. But what also happened was they had those little audio cassettes, and it was basically an audio tape revolution where dissident groups would sit around and they'd record a message, the Shah is terrible, I hate this guy. And they'd pass these around and give it to you, and you'd share it with everybody in your row, and you go, wow, that message resonated with me, so I'm gonna make 2 copies, I'm gonna give it to you and you. And these tapes went everywhere through the Iranian community all around Iran, but also in Paris and wherever there's also large dissident communities. And what happened was when the time was right, the revolution occurred. Nobody knew there'd be this revolution, but when a series of other factors came into play, the media information had already been, the media groundwork had already been laid. If you look at our counterinsurgency manual, FM 3-24, I haven't said it in a long time, 324, I think, right? They talk about the information line of operations being, one of the key elements of fighting these kind of war, these kind of battles, and it's true. And you look at the Middle East, and this new one. Let's just skip right ahead to this new media in the Arab Spring. Why do I always go backwards? This survey basically stays the same. This is a survey of, obviously, you can see the countries: Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, and Saudi Arabia. The blue represents Al Jazeera. They basically control the information and media space for hard news in those countries, except for Lebanon, because Lebanon has Al-Manar. Now, whose media network is Al-Manar? Anybody know? It's Hezbollah. It's Hezbollah's station. It's Hezbollah's news network. It's actually put on the State Department Instrument of Terrorism list, the actual media company Al-Manar is. You can watch cartoons on Saturday and cooking shows at 4 p.m., but when you get the news and stuff on Al-Manar, it's a Hezbollah agenda. Anyway, Al Jazeera, what's interesting about this, and you think about this revolution, so we got the U.S. wars, is Egypt, for instance, I think is really interesting. Because I talked to people in Egypt and I said, tell me about Al Jazeera. And over they would say, oh, Al Jazeera was like a breath of fresh air. When it first came online, it was amazing because we could hear and discuss and listen to things that we knew on the ground were real, but the state-run media organizations would never talk about it. Food riots, unclean air, the Muslim Brotherhood. And Al Jazeera talked about all these things. And so that combined, the standing up of Al Jazeera, for instance, because it's basically borrowed from the BBC format, and CNN, excuse me, and standing up, and then the rise of satellite technology, all of a sudden you had this alternative to the state-run media organizations throughout the region by this Al Jazeera. In fact, all these states, if you look back at the messages from the leadership, they hate Al Jazeera. Everybody except Qatar because it's funded by the Qatari family, and so it's their station. But the other thing is, I honestly don't think Arab Spring would have happened without Al Jazeera. I don't. When it stood up in '96, again, nobody knew what its impact would be, and nobody knew that in 2011 you would have an Arab Spring that would topple so many different governments or challenge so many different governments. But the reason was not direct action, not combat, but the reason was the information groundwork had already been laid. Al Jazeera had been laying it. They didn't plan this, but if you look also at the news media, when Arab Spring occurred, the news organization that was hit the hardest in Egypt was Al Jazeera. I mean, the government forces really went after Al Jazeera. And they blame Al Jazeera. They flat out blame Al Jazeera. When we invaded Iraq in 2003, we did the largest, in this first time ever, this ideology of the embed, right? We embedded 660 Western media into coalition forces for the initial push into Iraq. Why? Because Al Jazeera we'd identified over 35 Al Jazeera crews from Basra all the way to Tikrit. So we knew that one side of the invasion story was going to be told, the Al Jazeera side. And we were desperate. And credit to Rumsfeld and those guys for thinking, you know what, we need our story told. So we're going to counter that, not with more weapons, but with information. And so we embedded 660 media across the Third ID and the 1st Marine Infantry, the 1st MEF, 1st Infantry Division, and all the other combined elements and assets that we pushed into theater. And we got our story out, and one way or the other. So you have that. It's a crowded playing field. I'm not going to go into these too much, except just point out Al-Alam, which is an Iranian news organization. It also entered the fray. It stood up on February 23rd, 2003. So, sound familiar? I mean, it's right before we invaded, crossed the line of departure, invaded Iraq, because they wanted their say as to how this war was going down. So all they did at the time, they didn't have the satellite technology. They put a string of terrestrial broadcast towers all along the Iran-Iraqi border. And they broadcast, and they became a force in the Middle East media picture. But they did that only because they didn't want to get left out on telling the story of this conflict. So all of a sudden, then you get the Iranian Shia perspective. I got a late start because I kind of blew my intro, so I'm going to just go on. The third thing I want to talk about, which is sort of the combination of the other ones, which is U.S. wars in Iraq and this information, is there's been a huge change of rule. We've lost Mubarak, we've lost Gaddafi, and basically authoritarianism in the region is what keeps the peace, or what has kept the peace. The United States, we talk democracy and we love it. We want everybody to have it, but I don't know. Is it the best thing in an area where you have strong sectarianism, strong violence between, Sunnis and Shias? And so that's a huge thing to consider, because once the structure of an authoritarian regime is gone, like in Egypt or in Libya, Libya is imploding right now. And these areas, and you could argue Iraq, we go to war. Yes, we liberate it from Saddam Hussein. We install, based on a democratic rule, one person, one vote. Of course it's going to end up being a Shia leader in Iraq because the country's 70% Shia. So you get a Shia leader in Iraq, and all of a sudden you change sort of the balance of power, and you change the sectarian structures there. And here we go, Sunni Shia. If you look at this, I don't know if you can see, but like Iran, of course, 95% Shia. Iraq is 65 to 70% Shia. Do you remember Arab Spring? Do you remember what happened in Bahrain? So Egypt removes their president, Gaddafi falls later, there's issues in Tunisia, other places. Bahrain also stages a sort of like a coup against the authoritarian rule, except the coup is by the Shia, not a coup, but the uprising is by the Shia majority. And Saudi Arabia And Bahrain, the leadership, weren't going to have that. So Saudi Arabia drives in a tank division over to the island and helps crush the Shia awakening. Because it's like, it wasn't seen as an Arab Spring where we're just going to change authoritism to sort of democracy rule. It was like, wait a second, this is going to shift the balance of power in Bahrain from Sunni to Shia. And nobody could have that. And that's kind of what you've got going on right now. You've got a huge rivalry going on between Iran and Saudi Arabia for the region. And what the United States, for better or worse, and what we did in there, in my opinion, we've changed the entire balance of power in the region. Because it used to be that you had Iran was Shia, Saddam was Sunni, and even though it was a majority Shia state, he was like that Sunni wall. Iran was never going to be able to expand, never going to really be able to move beyond that border. And then, of course, Syria. In fact, Syria is even trickier because Syria, they're actually not technically Sunnis or Shias, the ruling class. They're Alawites, which in 1974, they were officially recognized by a Muslim cleric in Lebanon as being Shia because they do believe in family succession from Muhammad, which is one of the defining features between Shias and Sunnis. The Sunnis didn't believe that, the Shias do. But they started a strategic alliance with Iran, which is even more complicated and bizarre because Iran are Persian, the Alawites are Arab. They support Syria during the war in Iraq, the Iran-Iraq war, not necessarily by armed conflict, but they shut off the oil pipelines. They don't allow Iraq to pump anything out through Syria into Turkey, so they put the pinch on Iraq that way. And they were opposed to our war in the area. And now we see in 2012, I mean, we had Iran flights going across Iraqi airspace supplying the Assad regime with weapons. So you've got this bizarre situation where the entire region has been upended because you've had a loss of authoritarian rule, which probably, as bad as it sounds, would probably bring back a measure of stability. It wouldn't be good for dissidents, but it would bring back stability. You have strong sectarian, and you've stretched the balance of power because basically you have a Shia arc now, stretching from Iran to Iraq, Iraq to Syria. And we haven't had that in the modern Middle East. So this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran plays out in Syria and Iraq. In fact, look at the Jordanian pilot who was captured. You guys see that in the news? A couple weeks ago, he was shot down over Syria, or they say he was shot down. Our intel or our statements by our officials say it wasn't shot down, but for whatever reason, the plane went down, he ejected. He was flying a sortie with Moroccan, Saudi, and UAE pilots. So this is new. I mean, and 2 years ago, you saw Libyan arms on Qatari C-130 cargo planes flying into ISIS and al-Nusra Front-controlled Syria, delivering weapons to fight the Assad regime. Again, not that it's our region, but the U.S. has interest there, and it used to be that when a lot of things happened in the region, we kind of had a stake or a hand in it, and we're observing many things now. The Saudis and the Qataris are shuttling their own weapons in to support these guys. At the same time, they're doing sorties against Assad's regime and against IS, but that's what is so complicated about this situation. And you just saw a shift in policy now. It looks like the U.S. is not going to push for Assad's quick removal, but maybe a gradual removal, sort of going along the lines of what I think is Russia and maybe even is it Turkey, the other that sort of like argue that maybe Assad should stay. So this is a hugely complicated region. I guess my takeaway, because I know we got to go, is what led to this? Frankly, it's probably a little bit of all this stuff. The Sunni Shia sectarianism is there. It was behind everything, but it's kept in place by authoritarian regimes. Information revolution, which wasn't anybody's fault necessarily. All of a sudden, satellite technology is big in the 1990s, and you have the birth of non-state media institutions like Al Jazeera. They put out a message that was very much, had a lot of influence in the region. And then, of course, when the U.S. Removed Saddam Hussein, and we turned Iraq into a Sunni governance, from a Sunni governance to a Shia governance, the balance of power is completely shifted. So my takeaway is, frankly, we're in for a new reality in the Middle East. I mean, this is going to be decades of instability, because I can't really see what can put a lid on all this right away. Unless we welcome back authoritarian governments and they're able to really gain control. Either way, that's a lot of bloodletting, and that's going to settle some scores. If not, under this lack of authoritarian governments, you're going to see a lot of bloodletting and settling of scores and sectarianism, and that's going to be troubling, to say the least. So we're entering a new phase of history here in the Middle East, and I don't know where it's going, but I'm not optimistic it's going to be calm. And on that optimistic note, I will end because I know it's 10 to 1. So thank you very much.
So some of you will have to head off to your classes, but if you'd like to stay and ask some questions, we'd invite you to just form a queue here in front of the mic. Tell us your name, what you're studying, and we can take a few minutes and invite more discussion and questions with Dodge Billingsley.
Hi, Connor Mills, studying supply chain management. So what do you think is like the greatest threat that ISIS could pose right now to the United States? Like, are they staying in the Middle East, trying to control there, or do you think they would try to attack the U.S.?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but you see they sort of attacked the Twitter accounts of the CENTCOM command last week. So again, they're sort of flexing their global abilities. I mean, it's hard to say what the greater threat could be. One, I think they're definitely inspirational to other units or global groups around the world that think, hey, wow, look, extreme violence works. You know, we can do this. This is like more than an idea. We're like, you know, we're going to create the state, and they're putting everything in place to do it. They have an awful lot of recruits that are coming from European countries, and I think there's been a few, obviously, from the United States. We have to determine, as these other nations, what we do with these recruits if they want to come back. So on many fronts, they can inspire, they can erode, and they can cause us to expend a lot of resources in the region. It's weird. I mean, I don't think anybody wants to go back to Iraq, but I'm not sure. I don't know where Iraq goes without us. And look at I'm really curious to see how this presidential election happens in the primaries for the Republican Party, because you've got sort of two strong trends in the Republican Party. There's the Rand Paul trend that's basically isolationist, who doesn't believe we should mess around in any of these global hotspots or anywhere, really. We should withdraw. And you've got the McCain, you know, I'm sure Romney, I mean, they're in a camp that, no, you know, the world is a better place with the United States presence abroad. And so I'm not sure who's going to win out on that. So it's not usually just, you know, in the past you could say, oh, it's the left wants out and the right wants to fight. It's not like that anymore. I mean, there's a lot of people on civil libertarians and people from the right that are like, what do we have to gain from being in Iraq? So I don't know. Good question. And I didn't answer it really. I tried, but I don't know.
Taylor Moss, studying public health. You mentioned all the French citizens coming back and it being a problem. Do you foresee that as being a problem in the U.S. as well? What's the situation there?
It could be a problem. One of the things, I mean, we saw from the Boston bombing attacks by the two Chechen youth a few years ago is that, I don't know, and this isn't very politically correct either, but I think the biggest issue with global Islam right now is that moderates don't police their own. They don't. I mean, you know, we as a nation state, if we have extremists from any stretch, I mean, Timothy McVeigh, for instance, you know, we don't let that stuff, oh, because he wasn't a Muslim, he's a Christian, whatever. We don't let it go. And there's not enough of that standing up. It can be a problem because we have what, 600,000 Iraqi refugees living mainly in Detroit, but a handful in Salt Lake. We have 700 Syrian refugees going to be heading to Houston, I think, this month. And I think we're just going to start seeing the beginning of the Syrian refugee influx. And I think it's great that they can come here. I mean, it's wonderful. But there has to be the sense of, you know, if you're coming to this country, it's a democracy that actually works and functions, that majority does rule, but the rights of minorities are protected. And they have to, I think, they have to do that. I mean, they have to do that. And the French are going to, they have large Muslim populations. And I lived in France in the 80s, and you know, they say, oh, we're not racist at all, we don't have any problems. But you know what, whenever I'd go to the outer areas where the Islamic neighborhoods would be, or the Muslim neighborhoods, there were always policemen on every platform, and they were never checking me, but they were checking a lot of darker-skinned people wearing, you know, hijabs and, you know, men from that area. So there's an underlying tension there that's gone on long before the last decade, and I think they're going to have to sort that out. And again, you know, some of the way to tackle some of this, they say, you know, education and job opportunities. I totally believe that as well. I mean, if you have disaffected youth sitting around and they have nothing to do and they can go surf the internet and find messages that appeal to them, and war's kind of cool, let's go fight. And that's actually what's happened in Paris and other areas. And then these guys are actually, a lot of them are coming back and going, well, my IS experience was terrible. You know, I didn't have any fun at all. But again, once you go out there and do that, I mean, maybe if they had a job and everything else would be better, but I don't know. you're still gonna. There's a lot of people that will still attract. So I don't know. These are like there's no solid answer to these. I'm sorry to say.
Thank you. No, that was good.
Thanks.
I'm Michelle Zabriskie, and I'm studying biochemistry. And I have kind of a two-part question, more or less your opinion on what is the ethical obligation of the United States when they leave behind or abandon all of these resources that the ISIS has used? And the second part is, would ISIS have a stronghold or any other jihadist organization if the U.S. were not in the Middle East, if they didn't have opportunity to partake of the collateral that we leave behind?
Well, we didn't leave it behind. I mean, it was left in Iraqi armed forces, it was under their care. So the hope was that all that training of the Iraqi armed forces would have stood up an army that was capable of taking care of themselves. But they didn't do it at all. So a lot of that weaponry fell into their hands. So it wasn't, it wasn't just sitting out there somewhere. The Iraqis are supposed to be using it. We made a calculated decision that it was cheaper to leave that stuff there than to ship it out of Iraq, but also to help build Iraq, because we wanted to leave a strong Iraq armed forces there. In fact, when we left, though, a lot of Iraqis were happy that we left, of course, but there were calls by, say, the Iraqi armed forces actually asked us to stay. But we just couldn't solve some of the issues, with the status of forces agreement. So, I mean, we did add to the stockpile, but, here's the thing, too. What that did is it turned IS into a conventional army, tanks, Humvees, things like this. We've been blowing that crap up now since we started the airstrikes in late 2014. That stuff's easier to find and see. So if we get engaged with air power, that's one thing we can start to sort of turn back. However, when there's no air power there and you're going against unarmed Yazidis in the north part of Iraq, you can crush a lot of people. You can just roll right over these towns and stuff. So it does play both ways. I don't know. That's a tough question about collateral that we leave behind. I think of it on a personal scale. I mean, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people that translated for us, that helped our brigade commanders, and a lot of those people we've been able to get out, and we've left thousands and thousands behind, and they're on the short list to be beheaded because they're tainted by their experience with us. And there were those who probably felt like they wanted to side with an area that maybe could be democratized, and things like that. And we left lots and lots of people behind on the Iraqi side that are going to pay the price if they fall under IS control. So, I don't know. What was the first question you had?
The same. What's the ethical obligation of the United States? So.
Well, here's the thing. On a human rights level, and I say this about North Korea, we should liberate North Korea on a human rights argument alone. We should go in there and kick the crap out of IS, but is that our job to do it, and where do you stop? We should be in Nigeria. What Boko Haram is doing in Nigeria is absolutely horrendous. It's terrible. I mean, what they're doing to girls and women, and they're killing. It's terrible. And I just looked at satellite imagery of a couple of those towns that Boko Haram had gone through in the last 2 weeks. And I think the government, there's the idea that the Nigerian government is really understating the number of casualties from Boko Haram. So on a humanitarian level, we should be in 50 places right now around the globe. But that's tough. On a policy level, it's a really tough one.
Hi, Ashley Barlow. I'm studying English language. If I'm understanding you correctly, you think that killing the leaders of the operations may not be the best way to go. So I wanted to ask you what you think we should be doing, or if we should be doing anything, if we should be over there.
Okay. I'm not saying it's not the best way to go. I think you kill who you can. So if it's a leader or private or whoever it is, you go after whoever you can. As much as you can disrupt the chain of command, that's great. It's just not going to, they don't disappear. It's not and it doesn't work that way. Again, what we should do, this is the question. I mean, for better or worse, we've been in the Middle East for decades. We've really put our foot forward, and we've shaped Iraq since the invasion of 2003. We are partially responsible for what Iraq looks like right now. Does that mean we should be responsible for what Iraq continues to look like? Boy, you got me. That's a tough question. That's a moral question and a policy question, which I think, part of the reason, and I think people are frustrated that the Obama administration hasn't moved quickly on this, is which way do you go? Do you strengthen the Assad regime, the regime you swore you'd take out on numerous occasions? to fight ISIS? Do you go in and we have said we want to arm and work with moderate Sunni groups working in Syria? And then there was this idea, this sort of problematic issue of like, well, what's a moderate Sunni extremist look like, Sunni insurgent look like? And I remember there's a great article they were interviewing some guy in the New York Times, and they asked him, are you going to get weapons from the United States? He goes, I don't know. They said it has to be moderate. He goes, well, are you moderate? He goes, I don't even know what that means, you know. He goes, but he wasn't ISIS. He wasn't Nusra Front. He was more of a Syrian nationalist. Maybe that's what it is. But part of it is just getting an intel picture that really, what I think will happen, and you know, France, President Hollande said they were going to go to war now, right? That we're at war with extremist Islam. This actually, we've been talking about a global war on terror since 2001, but I don't know how global it's really been. We've been sort of leading the charge. We have some allies in a lot of the would-be smaller NATO countries. Like I've been out and worked with the Poles, the Slovenes, the Bosnians, the Romanians. They're all in it but they're not in it for Iraq. They're in it because they want to be a member of NATO. They want under the U.S. umbrella. They want all these. They have other reasons. With France, this happening in France and these little limited attacks in Australia and Canada a few months ago, I think you might see some sort of global, come together. I don't know, but there has to be some sort of unified approach, I think, because it's really big. And do you let some place like Africa just fall off the map because it's not like necessarily in your geostrategic interest for the time being? Because there's serious issues in Africa that are the same issues.
Thank you.
Another unanswered. All questions are unanswered. Just commented on. Just
My name's TJ Massering. I'm an ancient Near Eastern Studies major. And I was wondering, with the rise of the Shia influence, what you think the effects we're going to see in Israel over the next decade or so might be.
That's an interesting question. I don't know if I'm prepared. I don't know. I don't know what the effects on Israel might be. I've actually had this thought. We're not still being taped, are we? Lee, are we? Okay, I don't know if I want to talk about my thoughts on tape. I am still? Great. That's okay. No, I just thought, during the Iran-Iraq war, I'm convinced that the strategy of the United States was attrition. Let those two countries beat each other up so bad that they just keep each other kind of on the fence. And I look at Israel and I look at their problems with, their borders and their neighbors, and I think on one hand, there's probably some elements out there thinking, you know what, let these Arabs of different stripes destroy themselves. On the other hand, I know that they don't like that because chaos and instability mean that you can't tell. Like, here's the thing about stable authoritarian regimes. Once Israel had a more or less deal with Egypt, they knew what the deal with Egypt was. If you have a regime that collapses and chaos transpires in Syria, that's tougher for Israel because they don't know what that means. Who takes control of the limited chemical weapons? Who takes control of the military assets? What's the new policy? Or does it just become a terrorist base like Afghanistan was for such a long time to launch operations against Israel? Because the one unifying factor, of course, among all these Shias and Sunnis and Alawites is that, Israel is not for Israelis, it's for Arabs. I mean, it's for Islam. So, yeah, I don't know. I think it's kind of a mixed bag for them. But I think they watch it with trepidation. Anytime you have instability among your neighbors, you worry. If Mexico were to go really crazy and all-out war happen, and we saw a little bit of drug war, and we saw a lot of influx of illegal aliens coming across the border. But I mean, if you had complete chaos in Canada and Mexico, it would be troubling for us. So I think they look at it with trepidation. I think especially in places like Jordan, where you see a huge refugee population coming, we have military assets on the ground. We have a lot of other assets on the ground there. We're trying to figure out, and we're trying, because we just want this thing to stay where it's at and hopefully shrink it back. But goes to one of the other questions, like, do we stay, how long, and what do we do? What do we do? So, thanks.
Hi, I'm Will Sassine. I'm studying political science, and I was just curious as to what winning against ISIS looks like.
Well, ultimately, winning means you wipe them all out, but since it's an ideology with a command structure in this case, if you wipe out the command structure and you set the ideology back and you establish strong governments that can police and maintain vigilance in those states, that would be I think the ultimate. I think it's probably the best you can hope for. I don't think you ever, in the Shia Alawite governed Syria, if it turns out that stays, you probably never wipe out that Sunni interest in sort of taking control and feeling like they've been persecuted, from time to time, et cetera. Because the Sunnis are the majority, in Syria, but they're just run by Alawite government. Those problems and those feelings will still fester. unless you can somehow bring everybody in and it becomes a win-win for everybody. But I don't know how you erase. I mean, this is my sort of analogy when it comes to staying in Iraq. What do we do in Iraq? Well, I think to get rid of or have any hope of getting rid of sectarianism, I think you need a 100-year commitment in Iraq. I think right now we should sign up for at least 100 years, which that's ridiculous and impossible. But it's generational. You've got to convince, not this generation because they've lived through it, not the children because they're living through this crap already, but you've got to start to convince future generations that Shias and Sunnis, those two can live together. And then again, though, the moral question of this, who are we to tell them they should live together? We don't even, we're not even of the same religious background. So but I would say, destroy the command and control structure, and stand up the governments, get them strong enough that they have the political will. Iraq has got to they have to have a more inclusive government. They just have to. Even though they have a Shia majority, they've got to rally the Sunnis, and they've got to rally the Kurds. And if they stand on a unified front, they can do that, except they've been killing each other. Like right now, one of the biggest things, again, it's not reported well, but there's been a little bit trickling out, is the Shia militia groups that are standing up from the south that aren't under like state control. And they're going, and they're now conducting, from what I understand, just as violent of actions against Sunni areas or IS areas. And so they're not even under state control. So, again, that's sectarianism, because they're saying, hey, they're killing Sunnis. All of us Shias in the room, we're going out, we're going to get these guys. Who cares if the government acts slowly? We'll take care of it ourselves. And that's the problem. You just get more violence. It begins more violence. So, sorry. Such a optimistic topic.
Yeah. My name is Sam Music. I'm studying political science and Arabic. My question is now with new media coming out and propaganda with child soldiers, and also with the executions of foreigners in ISIS, and also recently with Russian spies, what is the best way that we can actually, the United States, but the world in general, counter this propaganda in new media?
Well, when it comes to countering propaganda, I think you have to counter it, one, with information. I mean, we have to be in the information game. We have to play this game for sure. I mean, I'd have this talk with my kids for completely different reasons, but I'm like, this mobile device is not bad or good. It's just a tool. And like, the initial embed in OIF1, we knew that one side of the propaganda story, and I'm not saying Al Jazeera side would be bad, but they were going to tell that side from that perspective. We wanted another perspective. Israel learned in Operation Cast Lead, which I think was 3 years ago, the war in January, that they didn't allow any media at all, any storytelling. And when they did a research study afterwards, they found that 7 out of 10 hits across the world basically had to rely on Al Jazeera for the news about that war. And Israel swore they'd never do that again, and therefore they've been trying to do better, making sure they have a media component. So you have to counter media with your own media. You have to counter their narrative with your narrative, for sure. But you also have to make it believable. One of the problems that the U.S. has, again, is that we stood up a couple, what's that site, not Al-Arabiya. And this is the interesting thing, too. Like, Al-Alama stood out by the Iraqis news network, by the Iranians, because they wanted a say in it from their perspective. Al-Arabiya was stood up by the Saudis, because the Saudis wanted a version to counter, because Saudis don't like Al Jazeera either. They hate those guys. So they had their own news network. And we stood up, gosh, what's the name of it? Congress-funded, we have a network in the Middle East. It's an Arabic network, and it's funded by Congress. Sadly, it's directed, nothing against the Lebanese, but it's run by Lebanese, which is okay, but man, that is not sort of the general pan-Islamic thought in the Lebanese community there. So I heard a lot of criticism from Arabs of different countries there in the region about that. One is because it has to be from a voice that's relevant. In other words, if it comes from the Army or the U.S. Office of Information, nobody in the fence, it's like trying to get an independent to go, you know what I mean? It's like, Republican or Democrat, right? I mean, it's like, you're going to go to sites and the U.S. Information Office isn't going to do it. You've got to put your message into vehicles that have some sort of traction in the region. The strongest regional traction right now is with Al Jazeera, continues to be with Al Jazeera. I'm not sure how much input we have in there. So that's one of the problems that we have. And we've been fighting that battle in Iraq and Afghanistan, is to get our information out and to make it credible, so it doesn't just come from an Army spokesperson or a CENTCOM commander. We've also done a lot of shutting down jihadi sites. We've actually taken a real, done our own sort of hacking, so to speak, to try to shut down a lot of these sites, especially the more violent ones and stuff like that. So we're, gosh, I mean, there were thousands and thousands of these sites while we were in Iraq, and we constantly shut them down. When I say we, I don't know who we is, but they get shut down and another one springs up. So it's kind of like bring your own media into it and try to, but if your information doesn't resonate on the ground, then it doesn't matter. And that's where we're kind of at a bit of a disadvantage, in my opinion, because we're a long way away. We're Christian. We're Israel's ally. Israel's ally probably counts as, I mean, there's always going to be one strike against us in the Islamic world, because we will defend Israel, and we'll defend Israel's right to be there. And so we just kind of, we start from like a negative, but it can work. I don't know how. I don't know. Hey, thanks for, do you have a question? Yeah.
Sorry, just a
Oh, no, that's okay.
last minute. Warren Fraser, International Relations.
Yeah.
I was wondering, you interviewed Shamil Basayev
Yeah.
and Salman Radiev
Radiev,
in the 90s, and I can't help but kind of see some similarities to Al-Shishani. Like, both of them were in like in their late teens, joined the Soviet military and went through that, and then I was just wondering why, with them, they ended up going for sort of this local, Caucasus Emirates style thing, and then people like Al-Shishani go and
Become globalized. And
yeah.
Well, in fact, that's a good point. In fact, the dispute between Al-Shishani and the Chechens and al-Nusra and some of the other Chechens was that the Chechens swore allegiance to Doku Umarov at the time in the Caucasus Caliphate. And they went down there to fight in this global issue, this IS thing, in the war in Syria against the Shias, the Alawites. And then Shishani breaks free and goes to ISIS. He sort of gives up that sort of allegiance to that. What I think is interesting, and I think about this a lot, because in the 90s I was in the Soviet southern frontier a lot, and I tracked guerrilla groups, and they were all basically Islamic guerrilla groups, except the Ossetians, which are Persian Christians. But the jihad has changed. I mean, it's really changed. If I look at the Chechens, who even like Shamil Basayev, who did go, I think, very fundamentalist, did fall into the Wahhabi camp during the sometime he transitioned from being a Sufi nationalist to a Wahhabist. But there weren't that many in Chechnya, but when they did transition, it was still like, our primary enemy is Russia. They're the ones that are spilling our blood. We're going to spill their blood. I've heard different things. I don't know for sure. Some of the Chechens I talked to think that guys like Shishani and those guys are fighting because the war in Chechnya is pretty much done. I mean, they can do stuff from time to time, but the Kremlin is allowed under Kadyrov to run a secular Islamic republic, right? So you can still be a Muslim in Chechnya, and in fact, there's more mosques now in Chechnya than there ever has been. They're just sort of state-controlled mosques, but it's okay if you're just a Muslim who's going to pray and just the basic tenets of Islam, you're good to go in Chechnya. I think Shishani and those guys really believe, they've seen the wars in Iraq, they've seen the wars in Afghanistan, and they believe in like this higher cause, I think, without having talked to them, had the benefit of talking to them, and they're going for a global jihad. I mean, the nature of jihad has changed. I ran all around the region in the 90s, and there was and I felt fairly safe to do so because I had contacts here and there, and I wasn't quite the enemy. Now I think that everybody outside that sphere is becoming the enemy. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. But, yeah, go ahead.
Would you say that that's kind of a global shift too? Because at least early on with ISIS, there was a lot coming from Kosovo, like Albanians coming from Kosovo into joining in ISIS as sort of the Islamist thing instead of kind of going against their Russians, the Serbs, right?
Right.
So is that sort of a global shift that's happening, or is that more regional, do you think?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I do believe there's a global shift going on. I think, again, part of it's information. We talked, you mentioned information. The ability to put your message out there and make it global is partially just due to the information revolution. You got to remember in the 90s, it wasn't that difficult. It wasn't that easy to push your message forward. But I think that, and I also think that there's a new balance of power reality in the Middle East between this sectarianism, the Sunni Shia split, and the whole area is up for grabs, and there's a lot of pressure. And again, if you're a Muslim kid, I don't know for sure, but I think of the Chechen bombers, if there's 600,000 Iraqis in the United States and 1% or 1% of 1%, is that disaffected youth? Because we have them in every religion, every ethnic group, and they just sort of latch onto this. They're going to go where they think that they can find salvation. They're going to go where they think they can find purpose. And again, a lot of them coming back to France actually come back and go, I found none of that. But the trouble is, it's up to the French authorities now to decide if that's a ruse and they're actually really now going to start their own little cell and pull a stunt like happened 2 weeks ago or not. And so it makes it really, really tricky. So I don't know. But I do believe there's a global shift going on right now. Sorry. I wish I could have answered definitively all these questions, but if I could have, we wouldn't be at war in the Middle East. There'd be, because people a lot smarter than me would be trying to solve this issue. Anything else? Hey, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for staying.